Welcome to the Magoffin Home here in El Paso, Texas. It's a Texas Historical Commission site, and I'm going to invite you here into the parlor. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Magoffin family, and we'll go over a little bit of history here at the home. Hi, my name is Machelle Wood. I'm the educator at the Magoffin Home State Historic Site in El Paso, Texas. We're a site that is run by the Texas Historical Commission. This home was built in 1875. It's an adobe structure, and it's technically classified as territorial style adobe. It's one of the oldest surviving adobe homes in the southwest region, and which is actually kind of quite a feat. And I'll explain, but in 1881, it was kind of a huge change for El Paso. It saw the change of El Paso being this dusty little frontier town into a thriving, economically sound big city. And what really led to that, in large part, was Joseph and his wife Octavia Magoffin, who built this home in 1875. Joseph had 1,280 acres that he had inherited from his father, James Wiley Magoffin. And he used that land to kind of parcel and help develop El Paso. But one of the things he noticed about El Paso and its need for development would be a railroad, a train station stop here in El Paso. So like in 1875, when he first moves into this home, he starts kind of working on that. He gets together with a business partner named Charles Moorhead, and they privately fund laying 8 miles of track on parts of Joseph's land. And they approached the International Railroad Company and said, look, we've got 8 miles of track laid, and we have strips of land that stretch from here to there. We will sell it to you pretty inexpensively if you'll promise to put in a train station in El Paso. They knew that the railroad would be absolutely vital to El Paso's development, because at the same time that they were fighting for this, they probably knew that in Mexico there was a push to build the railroad from Mexico City up to Ciudad Juarez, and also in Dallas there were talks about extending their lines from there as well. So why not meet in the middle in El Paso? So sure enough, International Railway took them up on their offer, purchased the land, and put in the train station. And in May in 1881, the first train stops in El Paso. Now in 1880, the last census before the train station was put in place and working, the population of El Paso was only 700. And over 90% of the structures in El Paso were adobe, because there weren't any brick companies here creating brick. There weren't any quarries for limestone. There wasn't a lot of forestry to use for wood construction. In fact, in the Magoffin home, all the wood had to be wagoned in from the Sacramento Mountains up near Cloudcroft, New Mexico, which was pretty expensive. So really the only wood in the home are around all the openings, the floors, and the ceilings. And so the rest of it had to be done with adobe, because El Paso has lots and lots of sand and clay and dry straw and water to help create the adobe bricks. And that's exactly what they did. And believe it or not, there were theaters in El Paso, public buildings that were built out of adobe, simply because that was the best building material they could get their hands on. Now, of course, in modern parlance, we would look at this and say it was sustainable. Of course, at the time, it was just something that was very practical. But as soon as that train station starts bringing in products and people, and the need for building new homes increased, you saw brick coming in, you saw wood coming in, you saw all other building materials that were necessary for building structures that we would see traditionally in other areas of the country that had the trains for a long time. And people started replacing their adobe homes. The Magoffins never did. Now realize the home right now sits on about 1.5 acres of land, but at that time it was on 25 acres. And we constantly ask ourselves, well, why didn't they just stay in this home and build a new modern brick and wood home next door? We really don't know. Perhaps it's the fact that Joseph was actually born in Chihuahua, Mexico. He had lived there as a child until he was 8 before he moved to Missouri in the United States. And maybe he had an attachment to adobe structures. We have had professors from Mexican universities who have come in and said that this is very similar to structures that you would see in Chihuahua, Mexico. So he may have very easily had an attachment to that kind of structure. It may have reminded him of home as a child. It very easily could just been a practical matter of why waste money building a whole other home when you have a perfectly good one that you worked really hard to make in the first place. We don't know, but we were lucky enough to have the adobe structure, and it maintains that sort of charm and quality. But what happened to El Paso's population was even more astounding. So we had all the products coming in and the people coming in. The next census, the 1880 census, had 700 El Pasoans. The 1890 census had a little over 10,000. So El Paso's population saw this huge boom, and like I said, construction was going on. We have this lovely bird's eye view of El Paso that depending on whose version of it you look at, whose printing of it, it could say 1883 to 1886. Ours actually says 1884. It's probably closer to 1886 by some of the buildings in there, but you can still see the adobe buildings right next to the brand new limestone city halls, the county courthouses, the hotels that have gone in that are wood. You can see the different building styles coming in, and slowly the adobe kind of dwindling in use. Now, Joseph actually, like I said, played a role in the railroad, but I would suspect that in large part due to his push for the modernization of El Paso with the railroad and making life a little easier for El Pasoans, he wins his first election for mayor of El Paso and becomes mayor in 1881, the same year as the railroad. I should also mention this is the same year he co-founds and becomes the vice president of the State National Bank here in El Paso. I believe that was the first local bank here in El Paso. And he further parcels his land and starts selling it for further development. To give you an idea of just how vast that 1,280 acres is, his home, the home that I'm standing in right now, is built on a portion of that. But it actually stretches all the way from the Rio Grande, which is quite a ways behind me, and all the way to the Franklin Mountains, which is quite a ways in front of me, and for blocks and blocks over to the east, and a few blocks over to the west as well. So we were kind of on the western section of the property, almost in the middle of it. So he had a lot of development to do, and he did so. And actually, I think one of the most fascinating things about his requirements for selling his parcels of land was that you had to develop it. It was actually in your contract. If you bought Magoffin property, you had to agree to develop it. You couldn't just sit on the land, you couldn't just resell it. You either had to build a home or a business. And Joseph, he serves 4 terms as mayor. First one in 1881, then of course he's elected again in 1883, and then we see him again in the 1890s. And another, he maintains his dealings with the government here, the municipal government in El Paso, in different ways. He serves as a county judge, he serves as a customs tax collector here in El Paso. He also gets involved with the Board of Health. He's one of the founding members of the Board of Education. Basically everything that, and he was very integral for bringing electricity, water, and gas, all the utilities that we take for granted in modern El Paso. He helped bring those, and those all started to form their boards in 1881. It really is the golden year of El Paso. So Joseph, he continues his work, and he ends up in another vital time period of El Paso's development, right at the turn of the century in 1899. In 1899, the City Hall, the brand new, amazing limestone City Hall, was being constructed. And this is while Joseph was serving his third term, I believe, as mayor. And this was just the fact that they were actually going to the trouble of building such a big, beautiful City Hall was actually a testament really to the growth and development of El Paso, because in 1873, when El Paso was first incorporated, city government pretty much didn't exist, only because nobody in El Paso was interested enough to serve in an office, and they certainly weren't interested in attending city hall meetings. So as the railroad comes and develops and El Paso grows, suddenly people cared about their city government, so much so that they finally agreed to fund building a city hall. And Joseph helped, he was the mayor at the time, so of course he had some oversight as to how it was done and funded. And there was a big, huge celebration. Now at the same time, I should mention the celebration was on March 17th, 1899. Yes, St. Patrick's Day. And yes, that did play an important role a little later on in El Paso. But the interesting part of that is at the exact same time, there were businessmen in El Paso who were pushing for, this is going to sound so familiar, I know many of you have probably heard this story. They were pushing for El Paso to secede from Texas and join parts of New Mexico, and at this time also parts of Arizona. Now, New Mexico and Arizona had not achieved statehood yet. In fact, they wouldn't achieve statehood for quite a few more years. But El Paso, there were businessmen, and it really was weird. It kind of divided down different lines. If you had a storefront where you sold goods, products, the vast majority of those supported seceding and joining New Mexico and Arizona. If you were a services person, for example, doctors, lawyers, you were pushing to stay with Texas. And the newspapers at the time had these amazing stories of, oh, so-and-so went into a local saloon and was overheard saying, you know, there's a bright star shining out in the middle of the day in El Paso. And this was on March 2nd, which of course is Texas Independence Day. Oh, this huge morning star was shining in the sky so late, around noontime. And someone had replied, well, of course, it's there to remind El Paso it's part of the Lone Star State. Of course, today now we have a giant electric star that shines on our mountainside that's also there, I'm sure, to remind us we're part of the Lone Star State as well. But at this time, they actually succeeded in forming a convention, and they invited people from New Mexico and from Arizona and from 3 counties within Texas, because they were trying to combine with a couple of other counties, Hudspeth and Culberson, I believe, to help join in his convention and push for secession from Texas. Well, Joseph was the mayor at this time. He's also trying to prepare for a city hall, a brand new city hall. And this huge party had been planned. There was going to be a parade and a dinner and a masquerade ball. I mean, there were ads all over the newspapers from all these different tailors here in town. Make sure you come in and rent your suit or your gown for the masquerade ball, because we're going to run out soon. It was a huge deal. In fact, there was some confusion even in the numbers that were entering El Paso. Everyone thought all these people who were coming in from out of town were coming in to go to the convention for secession. And there was some confusion as to whether that convention was going to happen on March 16th or March 17th. Some people were pushing for it to happen on March 17th, perhaps to interfere with the celebration, maybe, or perhaps to take advantage of the fact that so many people were in town for it. the parade had approximately 25,000 people show up. The population of El Paso at that time was 22,000. So even if everybody in the city had shown up for that parade, there were still 3,000 more people who had come in from out of town for the celebration. So they don't know why. There was some confusion as to whether it was the 16th or the 17th, but it didn't happen, obviously. El Paso is still Texas, right? So, but it was one of those moments where there was very heated exchanges with, in particular, the editor-in-chief of the Herald Post, who basically berated Joseph, claiming that he wasn't on the job, that he was more concerned about City Hall and the party that was going to happen to celebrate the City Hall instead of actually tending to business and trying to get El Paso a better position and secede from Texas. Believe it or not, El Pasoans, even back in 1899, had the belief that Austin wasn't aware that El Paso existed. In fact, the local papers called the people of Austin long-haired attorneys. I guess the word hippie didn't exist yet. So they were all the long-haired attorneys over in Austin. And of course, we can see remnants of that even to this day. It's something that people still talk about even now. But of course, again, I point out we're still part of Texas. But through the turn of the century, and then in 1906, his wife of many years, Octavia, passed away in 1906. Now, and all this time I've been talking about Joseph's contribution. That's not to slight Octavia. Whereas Joseph was very involved in politics and the development of El Paso, on the business end, Octavia was more concerned about its heart and its community. She was a founder of the Benefactor Society at a local Catholic church here, Church of Immaculate Conception, which is 4 blocks west of here and still exists. And she was very, very involved in charitable works here in El Paso. She was very well known for inviting people into the home and taking them in when they would first move to El Paso. Because as you can imagine, in that very early phase in 1881, they didn't have a lot of hotels built yet. They didn't have a lot of boarding houses. So Octavia would frequently take in travelers until they could get their room and board situated, until they could find a home. Beyond that, she helped raise money for Hotel Dieu, the first hospital here in El Paso, run by Catholic nuns. And then later on, there would be a teachers' convention that would happen here in the 1890s. And they had thought about the Women's League coming in, I believe it was the Women's Auxiliary, coming in and helping arrange for this teachers convention, because it was a national teachers convention. I mean, it was a huge coup for El Paso to be hosting this. And they actually ended up calling upon Octavia and asking Octavia, who was not part of that organization, but had such a reputation for hospitality and kindness and such a reputation for amazing entertaining, that she luckily said yes. And from what we understand from the newspaper articles of the time, she did a fine job. She stood up on a dais and gave a beautiful speech with her husband, welcoming all the teachers. But more than that, she made sure that every teacher who came to visit, which I believe is around the 2,500 region, helped make sure they all had room and board for their convention, that they all had entertainment, and that they all walked away from El Paso with a warm and fuzzy feeling about our city. And that was kind of her job, was to always make sure that everyone had the best impression of El Paso. While Joseph was selling the possibilities of the business and financial success of El Paso, Octavia was really kind of selling the heart and the community of El Paso. So, like I said, she passes away in 1906, and after that, Joseph kind of pulls away. He still remains the vice president of State National Bank, but he kind of pulls away from public life, and instead spends some time with his grandkids. They did have 2 children, Joseph and Octavia. They had Josephine and Jim. Jim would unfortunately also pass away in 1913 due to complications from appendicitis. Of course, they didn't have antibiotics then, so unfortunately he passes away at the age of 49. But he leaves behind a wife and 4 children who come and stay in the home with Joseph in his remaining years and help take care of him here in the home. Josephine had married a West Point graduate who would later become a brigadier general in the Army. But his name was William Jefferson Glasgow. We call him General Glasgow quite frequently. And they end up having 5 children, but of course, being an officer in the Army, he did travel a lot. Josephine would return to the home and have 2 of her children here in the home, but again, she would frequently take the whole brood and travel along with her husband. She wouldn't return to the home until, she would return for visits, but she wouldn't return permanently until 1929. At that time, she comes in and changes the home, and that's about 6 years after her father had passed in 1923. An interesting side note, in 1923, there were people within the community who were already talking about turning the Magoffin home into a house museum because Joseph had made such an impact, and there were people around who still had witnessed that, could still remember everything that he had done for the community. It didn't happen, but of course there were a lot of people calling for it. So Josephine, as the second owner of the home, and then her daughter Tia, really became the stewards of caring for the home and maintaining it. We're lucky enough today to have a lot of the artifacts from the family and quite a few collections within our archives of photos and letters and all sorts of wonderful documents that really couldn't have happened unless the family kind of planned to really use this later on within the community. And it is kind of appropriate that Tia would be the one who would help to negotiate the deal in 1976 to turn the home into a house museum, because she had served as a teacher here in El Paso. She had been a teacher at Radford School for Girls and then later on at Bowie High School. So I'm sure from an education standpoint, she would have realized just how truly important her family's story is to not only El Paso, but the whole region. And the idea of recognizing that El Paso had this great potential. And I have to admit, there are times when even I look around and I wonder just if Joseph had realized just how well we have met with his vision. So I'd also like to discuss a little bit about Joseph's parents and really his Mexican-American roots. It kind of starts with this gentleman right here, James Wiley Magoffin. James Wiley was from Kentucky, and he decided to get involved in trade, and so he went west. And he got involved with 2 trade routes, the Santa Fe Chihuahua Trail and the New Orleans, Texas Matamoros Trail. And he ends up in Chihuahua, Mexico, and lives there for 20 years, becomes completely bilingual. He ends up marrying a lady by the name of Maria Gertrudis Valdez, and they end up having 8 children. Joseph is one of those 8 children. And James Wiley had an amazing reputation. His nickname while he lived there was Don Santiago. And it wasn't until Joseph was about 8 that James Wiley decided to come back to the United States. He had purchased a farm in Independence, Missouri. So the kids all get sent to schools in the Missouri and Kentucky area. In fact, I believe Joseph starts off in Kentucky and then comes back through Missouri for his education. And they were all bilingual. And I know most people usually walk into the home and they assume with a name like Magoffin that, it sounds Scottish. Some people say Scottish, some people say Irish. They were actually from Ireland. James Wiley's father, Beriah Magoffin, had come from Ireland to Kentucky, and then by the second generation, they had moved on. But James Wiley eventually did purchase the land over here in El Paso, what would become El Paso. Of course, it was long before. And he used it as a trading post for people heading on their way from the west to California, particularly during the gold rush in starting in 1849. And Joseph, after he finished his education in Missouri and Kentucky, came back to the area here and worked for his father for a bit. Of course, this was all interrupted by the Civil War, and El Paso as a whole, well, not entirely a whole, there was of course some debate, but the majority of people in El Paso sided with the Confederate Army. And so James Wiley Magoffin went and served as a officer that would help procure provisions. And it kind of was in his wheelhouse. And both Joseph and his older brother Samuel went off and became eventually quartermasters, and were stationed down near the Houston area, which is where Joseph had met Octavia. Octavia is from an Irish family, and they had come through and were living there in Victoria, Texas. And Joseph actually spent some time after the Civil War in that region. And it really wasn't until the end of the war, or when James Wiley, El Paso, the Union Army came through El Paso and started confiscating lands from Confederate sympathizers. And of course, the Magoffin property, Magoffinsville, was taken. And so James Wiley left to San Antonio to be with some of his relatives there in San Antonio. And unfortunately, he doesn't survive to receive the land back later on. But he does sign the property over to his son Joseph. And the reason why it was Joseph and not Samuel is Samuel had perished during the Civil War. He was stationed near Louisiana and had met a young lady there and had fallen in love, and they were about 2 months away from being married. And unfortunately, he died there, or in the area of the plantation, when some troops came through. So this piano is reportedly one of the first items that shipped in on the railroad in 1881. It comes to us from Baltimore, Maryland, and it's made by William Knabe. Both Octavia and Josephine played it. They were pretty accomplished pianists, and they would use it to entertain here in the home. So when the home was first built in 1875, it really, this wall that you're looking at right now was the exterior wall of the home. As their family grew, as they had more people here living in the home, they added on bedrooms. So now there's a room back behind this wall. But when this wall was first built in 1875, there are family histories that indicate that Joseph was not happy with the angle of this wall. There had been a story that once the home was completed, he was not happy that the wall was not quite square, so he had them build a second wall inside the wall. And perhaps this is when they put the cabinet in. A lot of people question, why is the cabinet so high up? We have had people point out that it is at the same level as the windows, and perhaps there had been a window there. We're just not sure. We do know from the photograph from 1877 that 1887, that this cabinet was in place by then. And but the funny story is there was a point in 1994 when some work was being done to make this into a little bit more comfortable of a house museum. Things like ductwork and things were being put into place. Well, the part of the wall kind of opened up over here by the connection with the front of the building, and allowed us to see just how thick this wall is. This wall is about 5 to 6 feet thick, which would indicate that indeed it probably is 2 walls combined. And it would account, because if you're going to put in, if this cabinet, in fact, I will open it for you just so you can kind of get an idea just how deep this cabinet is. Not everyone gets to see inside this cabinet, so. But it's a pretty deep cabinet, which means they would have had to cut pretty far into the wall to do it. And if you were cutting this thickly into the wall, it would make the walls a little less structurally sound. So it makes sense that there would at least be 2 walls, and this one isn't necessarily a supporting wall for the ceiling, but it's just here to kind of house the cabinet and make the room straighter for Joseph's sanity. So Josephine was a huge fan of Santa Fe style architecture. And of course, you know, when you inherit something from your parents, like a home, you probably don't want it to look just the way your parents had it. You want to update it and make it cool, right? So for her, Santa Fe style architecture was perfect. And of course, she's living in an adobe home, so it blends perfectly. So she comes in and she plasters over her mother's wallpaper. And when I say over her mother's wallpaper, I mean over all the layers of her mother's wallpaper. Under that, her mother's wallpaper is still sitting there. And we still are able to dig out pieces from prior pieces of work that we have done here in the home, periods of restoration. We have already collected quite a few samples of the wallpapers here in the house. Now, Josephine also puts in this recessed lighting up in the corners, and this really is, as far as we can tell, the first time this home is lit with electric light. You know, a lot of people ask us, because Joseph was such a huge proponent of electricity and water and gas, a lot of people ask us about when electricity was put here in the home. That's actually another funny story. Other than, you know, the fact that he maintained an adobe home while other wealthy people in the area were replacing theirs for wood and brick, he also didn't electrify the home as far as we can tell. He did put an electric light out by the gate at the street, but he didn't really electrify the home. There are family histories that indicate he liked the smell of kerosene, so he maintained kerosene lighting here in the home. And it wasn't until Josephine occupies the home in 1929 that she comes in and does the Santa Fe treatment to her mother's walls. She plasters right over her mother's wallpapers, cuts out niches, and puts in electric recessed lighting. So these fixtures that you're looking at now that, you know, we're putting in the rooms that are being interpreted as her mother Octavia's time period are reproduction, but they are true to what you see in the photographs. And pretty much that's what we've relied on in restoring the home, are the photographs from the time periods we're reflecting. He probably is a trinket picked up on the trip to the beach. We know from family histories that they did like to travel to the beach. They frequented Baja, Mexico, quite often. And so he was probably picked up, much like a lot of these items in here. You see, fans and plates and pottery and, porcelain and all that kind of stuff in here. And everything pretty much is stuff that you can tell has been picked up on trips to Asia, to Europe. And so he probably is another one of those trips. And can you imagine, I mean, this is a room where people came in to talk to the Magoffins. And can you imagine looking up at the chandelier and seeing this hanging there? Because it is in the 1887 photo. It was hanging up there when Joseph and Octavia were greeting people here in the home. If you can imagine, I mean, that must have been such a conversation starter. I'm sure they had a wonderful story attached to him. We just don't know it. No one wrote it down. So here at the Magoffin home, we have also, as part of the tour, a dining room, family parlor, several bedrooms, and even a turn-of-the-century bathroom. So if you come see us, we are open from Tuesday through Sunday. On Tuesday through Friday, we have self-guided tours most of the day, with guided tours at 10:30 and 2:30. And then on Saturday, all day is guided tours every hour on the hour, the last one starting at 4 o'clock. And Sunday, we're open from noon until 5, with the last tour starting at 4 o'clock. So I'd like to thank you all for joining us here at the Magoffin home today, and we invite you to come back and see us sometime. Thank you.